On January 16th, the pro-Yanukovych majority in the Rada pushed through a series of laws outlawing particular protest tactics and curtailing the activities of foreign NGOs. The laws were voted on by a show of hands, in contravention of the parliament's rules, and votes were counted for deputies who were absent, leading some to call the act a coup. Interior Minister Zakharchenko, echoing language he had used at the beginning of the crisis, said that every offense will be met on our side by a tough response within the framework of the current legislation. The laws quickly became known collectively as the dictatorship laws. Ukraine's democracy appeared to be at stake. On January 19th, thousands of protesters, outraged by the dictatorship laws, confronted security forces protecting government buildings. The ensuing violence further radicalized the protests. As a result of the dictatorship laws and the violence of January 19th, opinion among the protesters began to solidify around a set of new demands. These included the release and amnesty of arrested protesters, the reversal of the January 16th laws, and reversion to the 2004 version of the Constitution. Many now called for Yanukovych's resignation. The following week, Yanukovych met with Batkivshina leader Arseniy Yatsenyuk and offered to appoint Yatsenyuk prime minister and Vitaly Klitschko deputy prime minister for humanitarian issues. He also offered to reconsider the dictatorship laws. Yatsenyuk insisted that he was willing to negotiate, but also said that signing the EU association agreement was a key demand. No agreement was reached at this time, and, as became apparent later, it is not clear that Yatsenyuk had any mandate to negotiate on behalf of protesters. Yanukovych put the opposition parties in a difficult position. An agreement was necessary to end the crisis, but negotiating to join Yanukovych's government would undermine their credibility. On January 28th, Yanukovych fired Prime Minister Azarov, and the parliament reversed several of the dictatorship laws. While these concessions were cheered on the Maidan, they did little to diffuse the protests. The protesters were seeking repeal of all the dictatorship laws, as well as returning to the 2004 Constitution and signing the AA. While protesters increasingly rejected compromise with Yanukovych, they had no way to put more pressure on him other than turning to violence, which most still rejected. In late January and early February, two seemingly contradictory trends coexisted. On one hand, negotiations between the Yanukovych regime and opposition leaders appeared to be making progress. On the other, the likelihood of violence was increasing. The threat of violence may have spurred Yanukovych to seek a compromise, but it also empowered the more extremist protesters. On January 21st to 22nd, 3 protesters were killed by police. A protest on February 2nd drew an estimated 50,000 people to the Maidan, rather than the several hundred thousand that took part in December. That may have emboldened Yanukovych while concentrating the influence of the more militant among the protesters. The Russian government advocated ending the protests forcibly. Putin's advisor on Ukraine issues, Sergei Glazyev, said in an interview that, in a situation where the authorities encounter a coup attempt, they simply have no choice but to use force. Otherwise, the country will be plunged into chaos. Accusing the United States of arming Ukrainian protesters and training them at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, Glazyev went on to say that under the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, Russia was obliged to intervene to prevent such a threat to Ukraine's sovereignty. Reuters reported that Russia was withholding a $2 billion loan until the protesters were cleared from the Maidan. In early February, Batkivshina party leader Arseniy Yatsenyuk continued negotiating with Yanukovych, saying that he would agree to become prime minister, with Yanukovych remaining president, if the 2004 Constitution were reinstated and if a government of opposition figures was appointed with assurances that they would not soon be fired. We have a short and a long-term plan. The long-term plan foresees the preparation of a new constitution draft and its adoption by September. Our short-term perspective is to achieve the return to the Constitution of 2004 as a temporary decision until we adopt a new constitution. At this point, constitutional reform and a change of course, not the ouster of Yanukovych, were still the main goals of the mainstream opposition, but support for Yanukovych's resignation was growing. Progress was also made on the protesters' demand for the release of arrested protesters. On February 14th to 16th, a compromise was reached in which the government released 234 prisoners arrested since December, and protesters vacated City Hall and other buildings, and some of the barricades around the Maidan were breached.